mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. We bring the resource to you, the DU Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. Today on the show, I have two guests from the Rock Island Auction Company. I have outside consultant Richard Ellis and Director of Acquisitions Rick Henley. Welcome to the show, guys.
Nice to meet you, Kat.
Thanks for having us.
I get at the museum, well, we currently, just to preface for our audience, have Richard's personal collection of guns and some powder tins as well on display in the museum. And the guns we have are big guns. They're punt guns and large bore guns, and they are probably, well, they're the most popular things in the museum, like hands down. The punt gun is hands down the most popular thing in the museum. We get lots of questions about them. We have lots of crazy things said about them, which I eventually want to get into some of the myths about them. The first thing I want to start with, and I also want to talk about other classic waterfowling guns as well, but let's just go ahead and go. Well, actually, before we go straight into the punt gun, I'd like to get y'all to give me your background and how you got into like waterfowling guns in general, and did you have a hunting background or a collecting background? How did you get into this? How about you start, Richard?
I've been in collectible firearms and an interest in any firearms since I was a child. I was carried to gun shows and always had an active role with the firearms, and it became my profession. I've done it from all levels. It doesn't matter from shooting to learning about them, appraising. And when I was younger, I hunted, but I kind of weaned myself from it. I'm too busy to do it. I don't have the chance to enjoy it like when my grandfather was alive. He was an avid sportsman. He was a farmer, so he would have all his spare time when the crops were harvested. He would hunt all winter and fish all summer. So when he passed away when I was young, I kind of lost my hunting companion. And then, my interest kind of waned, but I was always active with the guns, a multitude of levels. And the nice thing with this collection, it's all antique. It's all, the market hunting ended finally abruptly in 1918 with the Federal Migratory Act, which stopped all that nonsense with shooting huge quantities of ducks. There was no sportsman tendency to it, and the Boone and Crockett Club had a lot to do with that. There was politicians that were part of that we got really good, sensible conservation laws to keep the hunting alive, and as these market guns always intrigued me. Most of them are English. When you find them, there's a preponderance of English guns that were made for the market hunting, and I think they carried on further. But my collection that's on display is all American, and you will see 100 English guns for every one American made gun. The powder end of it, why I had the powder kegs and powder tins, is that, these being muzzle loading, that's all they use. They use raw powder. And, I was seeing there's a series now about DuPont and, what his contributions are, the whole family, they made their money. They always went back and forth. They're more into chemicals now, but the gunpowder has always been a huge asset. So I thought that was always interesting when you have those market guns, you have to have what supplied them. So, but they're very detailed how they did those cans. And it's almost like, marketing, because being part of the auction company that I, been here since inception, is the fact that you market, and there was all these different companies, and just DuPont grew so large. For example, they bought out a lot of their competition, but there was all these different companies that made powder, and it was still black powder is black powder. It just depends on what grain it is, whether there's more of a coarse grain or a fine grain, but they would all make the package to sell it, and they're just finely decorated, as Katie, you've been aware of it, but so I guess that's my life story in a nutshell.
All right, Rick. Well, how did you get into all this? What's your background?
Mine might be a little shorter. So I really didn't grow up in like a big gun family or even really hunting that much. My dad, he had a few hunting guns, but as he always told me, he never hunted for sport as a kid. He hunted to eat. And so when he was old enough and had money, he didn't want to do that. But every once in a while, every few years, my one uncle from the UP of Michigan would come down to pheasant hunt in Iowa. And I just remember, I'd go out every once in a while with him with my BB gun. And I love that. I love those memories and love doing that so much that when I got into high school, I basically just told my dad, I'm going to start hunting, and got into it with some friends. And then when I was going to college, I got a part-time job at a gun store, hunting store, and then just decided I really enjoyed that. And so I went to work full time basically for a different outdoor store, and just kind of from the hunting side of it. And then they had, just like one of the collectible gun rooms, and started getting interested in that part of it, and started buying for that company. And then found out about Rock Island Auction. And I grew up about an hour away from the office here, but just kind of decided this is what I wanted to do, and applied here, got a job here, and the rest is history. So
did you start out or do you do mostly guns in general? Or do you focus on certain types of guns, or how does that work at Rock Island? Do y'all specialize in different areas?
Everything. I mean, if it goes bang, we can sell it. So we've had the earliest hand cannons to modern day guns, class 3s, machine guns are hot. And everything in between. Cannons, tanks.
Do y'all have an auction? Is it coming up, or did you just have one?
Just last weekend we had one.
Just last weekend. Okay. Yeah. And when would you be your next one? How do y'all do auctions? Y'all do them quarterly, or what's the deal with it?
Yeah, so we have 3 different types of gun auctions.
Okay.
Like the one we just had, and the one you kind of see, all the advertising and marketing about is our premier sales. That's what we just had last weekend. That's where you're going to see the 6 and 7 figure guns. And so we hold 3 of those a year. The next one of those will be in May. But then we also have other auctions that are geared more towards kind of beginning collectibles, affordable antiques, shootable sporting arms. And then we also have one that's kind of more like your more modern, new in box, kind of gun store type stuff. And we have one of those basically every month.
Let's go back, because I really kind of want to focus just for a little while on the punt. Can one of you explain to our audience exactly what a punt gun is?
Okay, I can jump in on that. The punt guns generally are the larger bore, the ones that actually massive gauge. They fired a great heck. Some of them fire as much as 2 pounds in shot, and their idea was to get between the most ducks they could shoot with one shot. It was purely a business. They're basically artillery. They're percussion artillery. It's like a cannon, but it's firing a shot. And when I use the term market gun, well, they branched down to smaller ones. They're still with the Federal Migratory Act, they banned anything above larger than 10 gauge. So as you'll see with my collection, there are 8s and 6 gauges. That's about all you can really throw to your shoulder and still fire. When you get past that, you get into some of those 1.25 bore kind of things. That's like putting a cannon to your shoulder if you can lift it. One of my weapons there, I mean, that thing might be 80 pounds. I mean, I think it looks, but it appears like you could put it to your shoulder. And my kids growing up, they were always having a contest who could actually hold that to their shoulder, and then it became the cousins and the nephews, and they look like the front line to the Bears or something. I mean, I've got 6'5". I'm 6 foot, and I'm the smallest guy there sometimes. But it takes a hefty guy to throw that can into his shoulder, whereas it was really meant to mount a bracket over in a skull boat, which they call the hunting boats. They call them skull boats. And basically they would mount it over the keel, basically the boat pointing forward. But, some of them I've had years ago that were just so crude. They look like a piece of timber and block, and they actually had fabricated shock absorber kind of things. But they never really appealed to me. They just looked like a big piece of sewer pipe or something attached to some bands. And at least the ones that I've put on display with your museum, are the ones that I always favored. I mean, they just had the look.
Right.
And I think you're well aware of it, Katie. I mean, you actually had to make a kind of a mount for one of them that really came out very nice.
I had to make a mount for both of them, actually.
Yeah. And I haven't seen it. I'm looking forward to coming down there to see my collection. We're coming down, so I just have photos.
Yeah, they don't make mounts for those because they can't. Well,
No.
One, they're the size of them, so that's a problem, and then two, the weight of them. So you have to be able to hold the weight and the size of them and get them. And you want them, right at that perfect, nice and level, and so you get that look of what it looked like in a boat. Okay, so they're mounted in the boat. I'm trying, kind of paint a picture for people because I think if you haven't seen one, it's really hard, and I recommend you can look it up online, and there's lots of places you can see them. You can see them on y'all's site. So would they load them in the boat or on shore and then mount them? Like what would be the method?
Generally, the first round they would already have preloaded.
Okay.
Because once this event happened, you had a lot of ducks floating in the water. I mean, it was an event. Plus, you just scared away any others for miles around.
Right.
Because but they would most likely, at least the first round, preload. Then they had to mount it. Now imagine these skull boats. They had it'd be like, everybody knows what a canoe looks like.
Right.
Imagine a wider in the center canoe. People know what rowboats look like, but
it's
like
profile.
a fattened, very low profile, because they had to camouflage. They were trying to get as close to the duck. They shot them on the water.
Right.
I mean, there was no sport here. This was purely for business. And, they were and when they say market, it was the meat for market. They were selling the ducks, to feed people. So low profile, kind of a flattened, imagine a canoe that's very low profile. Well, it has to be reinforced because you had a great deal of, from when these fired, usually they were bracketed down into the boat. They'd have a strap, some sort of a strap to the forward nose, not like an oar, because it would probably rip the side off the boat. It had to be mounted somehow. And some apparatuses that I've seen had shock absorber kind of tendencies, but they were crude at best a lot of times.
So once they have it on the boat, and I mean, it's already loaded, it's on the boat, and it's such a low profile, and I'm sure the weight of it makes the boat cumbersome to navigate. How are they navigating this boat to the ducks, and how are they getting into position?
They would, a lot of times they start in low light situations, before dawn. You'll see some of the old lanterns they use. I mean, you have to understand, this was all done before, Westinghouse made spotlights. We're talking about basically some reflective capability in a kerosene lantern to get them close. They just go in as silent and as quiet. They would oar their way in and get as close as they can, because the closer they get, the more numbers of ducks they would kill with a single round.
So I'm guessing they would also have someone, or at least someone in another boat behind them trying to chase cripples, because I imagine there's a lot of cripples in this situation.
Oh, absolutely, and there'd be backup guns. Just like by the same token, they were not these people. They were just thinking of a business. If they didn't get the secondary one, so be it. There'd be another round.
So okay, what would be a typical size and weight of a punt gun? Just to give that idea. I know they can vary. Like the one in your museum can be pretty short as well. But what would you say like the average size of a punt is?
I'm going to pass this over to Rick. He did a very nice tape on this matter. So go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, you would see a bit of a difference between like the percussion guns, right? Where you could see a whole variation of different size bores. But then once they started getting into breech loading stuff and actual cartridges, stuff got more standardized. So, and when you got to that point, you'd see like 2 bores, 1.5 bores, 1 bores. And so to give you an idea, like, and maybe you guys have discussed this before, but the idea of a 12 gauge or a 12 bore is the amount of round balls of that size it takes to make a pound, right? That's where like that comes up with. So a 1 bore would be obviously a ball of lead that size is 1 pound. So big. You're talking 2-inch bores basically at that point. I can't remember exactly what the nominal bore is for a 1 bore as far as in inches, but like I said, very, very, very large rounds at that point. But then with the percussion stuff, it's not standardized, so you could have a whole different variation of sizes at that point.
So what is the evolution? It's not very long. They weren't around that long. So from going from like the muzzleloader to these breech load, like how did that evolve? Did that include like manufacturers at that point, in the later point, and how did it come from there? Because some of the early ones are very crude, like we talked about. But what's that evolution on the gun?
Yeah, you saw again a lot of the muzzleloader ones would have been just like any muzzleloader, custom made. At that point, just whatever they decided they wanted to make, and like I said, they'd be very crude. As you said, these weren't necessarily popular for very long, and there weren't a lot of manufacturers out there making them. As Richard said, predominantly you saw English manufacturers making them, because there's actually guys still in England today that use them. But yeah, so like some of there were some English manufacturers that were well known for making punt guns, and by well known means they made a few hundred of them maybe. But yeah, I know we've sold some Holland and Hollands. We've sold several Holland and Holland punt guns that came through here. So, you think of somebody that's as well known as Holland and Holland making them. So it was obviously something where they had customers that wanted them, but it was still a pretty niche market for sure.
So in terms of like collecting, so this always comes up, and I don't know if this is like the exact term, but this is what I've always heard it called. You have punt guns, and then like you'll also come up with these, people will say they're punt guns, but they're actually what I've heard referred to as castle guns. How does someone, like if you're looking for these, like how they tell the difference between them, and what's the difference? Like explain that to everyone, because I have found people come up and say, I have a punt gun. And I'm like, no, you don't. So can you explain that a little bit more and what the difference?
I can jump in here. What basically, when they talk about castle guns, a lot of the large weapons that were made were just exactly what they're saying. They were fortress defense guns. The Europeans had these massive, big, that are mistaken for punt guns, which in fact they'll have almost like even a spade on some of them. The Dutch made a lot of them. It's under the muzzle, because they went just like you think of a castle, and they would actually go, they'd be on top of the wall, and these walls might be 5 foot thick, for example, and to check the recoil, because you've got this massive firearm, many of which with a 1-inch kind of bore with a lot of powder behind them, that if you can imagine a protrusion, it looks like a triangular spade coming down under the muzzle that could rest itself against the outside wall of the castle. And the fortress defense guns, castle defense guns, and they get mistook all the time for punt guns. But there was a great deal of them made, and even, a lot of them were exported, like, say, for example, into China, into Asia. They had their emperors and stuff had massive walled defense castles. And that's what that term is. But a punt gun actually is just exactly what we're talking about. It was meant to float in a body of water, in a scull boat or a boat of some nature, purely to shoot waterfowl. And it comes in all forms. And you were kind of going back to asking how heavy. I think that one that I have there in the display is like maybe 80 pounds.
Yeah, and then I have one that's there to kind of give. It's there long term, but it's one of the more crude ones from Chesapeake Bay, which is pretty. It's ambiguous with that area, and it's probably 9.5 feet long, and it takes about 4 of us to get it in there.
Yeah.
And it's really crude, like it's a steel pipe, basically.
Yeah, God knows what it weighs, whereas your basic sportsman shotgun, the 12 gauge people are throwing to their shoulder to hunt ducks is, 6 pounds, 7 pounds, 8 pounds.
Right.
So it's a big difference. And most of those market guns that I have down there, they're in the 12 to 15 pound range because they're a bigger bore, little beefier. If you can throw them to your shoulder, man, you get past 12 pounds, 10 or 12 pounds, you start to get cumbersome, and then some of those go 15 pounds. But they aren't, as we discussed before, they're not punt guns. They're market guns.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask a few more questions but I have 2 more questions about the punt itself. With the punt, you get these myths or about them like that, and I kind of want you to debunk them a little bit. Or not. Maybe I don't think they're true, but the idea of they would throw anything in there for shot, like that's not true, correct? They used regular shot and black powder.
Most 95% of the time, other than I've heard those myths, but hey, they could have used other items. They could have used old nails and stuff, but it wouldn't make sense. You wouldn't have any, consistency to it. It does. If you've tried to fire that, I've seen guys do test shoots with cannons and stuff, and it just flies everywhere. So yes, that is a myth. They actually, if they were taking the time to make the weapon, they could cast or acquire lead shot in varying sizes, and
Well, it wasn't like neat shot. I'm sure they made it themselves. Like it wasn't it's not like what we think of as a BB, but yeah.
Or they could source it.
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely. There's this much the way of sourcing the powder. The shot was available. I mean, there's famous shot towers that were like up in Dubuque, Iowa, for example, down in St. Louis, Missouri.
Philadelphia still has one standing.
Right. And the way they made the shot, they dropped it from a elevation into cold water. And that's what, when it hit the water, they had almost like straining devices at the top, and the lead was melted, and then it dripped down. And when it hit the water, they got their varied sizes from the amount of lead. It's like a strainer. Yeah, I guess would be the way to do it.
And it's a long drop.
Yeah, a very long drop. I mean, the towers were very high. 100 plus feet.
Yeah, it's funny how they came up. Who knows how they came up with that? How many ducks did they actually kill? I mean, like, I know there are like high records, but let's talk about like the average shot. Like, how many like ducks were they actually killing with these guns on average?
Well, I've seen some instances that they, the bigger, larger bores, they were averaging between 50 and 100 birds, but I'm not sure. It really depends on the size of the weapon they were using and how much shot you put out there. You're only going to hit so many. If you do one of those cannon size ones that we're talking about with 1 to 2 pounds of shot, you're going to get in that 50 to 100 kill range.
Yeah, and I'm guessing they were typically mostly the same species of ducks that they were after? I'm like canvasbacks. That's what I mostly hear.
Yeah, I don't think they were as selective, but if they had, it depends on the area. It's like I live on the Mississippi River up, in Iowa, and it's predominantly mallards. I have seen canvasbacks on rare occasion today, but God knows what it would have been 100 and some years ago. Rick's probably a little. He hunts a lot over in Central. I go ahead. What's out there, Rick?
Well, just like anybody duck hunting, right? I mean, yeah, you might see a ton of mallards, but then there'll be other stuff in there, and I'm sure it was the same back then. And as Richard just alluded to, I mean, cans or canvasbacks were, way more prevalent back then. But they were such good eating that they did get hunted down quite a bit. So, but I don't think they were. It wasn't as much about getting specific birds, I don't believe, as it was just getting a pile of birds, and like I said, for meat markets and the feather markets and that kind of stuff. So one thing I would just add to that too, though, is like there was some technology as well to the punt guns. Like we sold a double barrel punt gun not too long ago, which is pretty rare. We haven't seen very double barrels come through. But one of the things that they would do is they would set them up so that when you fired the double barrel, right, that it would shoot the first barrel, and then automatically about a half second or however much longer later, it would shoot again, so that it would get some birds, but then it would also flush up birds. And then shooting.
Yeah, to get the ones flushed.
Yeah, get the ones flushed, and then you have it. Yeah, especially like I know
Smart.
I've tried shooting a few winter birds off the water, and it protects them pretty well, that water. So getting them up off there would have made a big difference too. So
another thing I've always heard, and I don't know if this is true either about punts, but once they became illegal, they still were used, right? They didn't just like anything, when something becomes illegal, they don't just disappear. People still are trying to use and take advantage of them because they were getting so many ducks, and that's how they were making their living. And so one of the things I always have heard is that if they were about to, say, get caught by a game, I guess it was a game warden at that point, but they would throw them over the boat and stick a paddle in the water and come back for them. Is that true?
Go ahead, Rick. I'm not aware of that.
I don't know any. I can't remember where I heard that before, but
I've never heard of that. But I have heard of them sinking boats from firing them. So
yes.
But I guess you throw it it'd be better to throw it in the water than get the ticket. I guess.
I mean, some of those could last, hurricane so much underwater because they're literally just steel pipes and blocks of wood. But the next thing I want to talk about are the shouldered ones. So is the timeline of the market guns about the same as the punt? Is that, I'm guessing they're using them a bit differently. Where are they in this history, and how are they used?
Well, it would be in the same time period. It's just depending on whether somebody wanted to go to the extreme of making the boat and shooting huge numbers of them and making more of a business, or going with a larger type bore, shoulder fired weapon. And it's just a matter of quantity. You could have, Walmart sells a huge amount of quality or quantity, or you have a local mom and pop store. So, it just depends to what extent, how serious they would get. Maybe they go out and shoot 5 to 10 ducks and sell them to the local store or barter them for other items they need, such as flour or sorghum or whatever.
So these market guns, so they're killing multiple ducks at a time as well. My question really is like, okay, so to compare it to like ammo today, like let's talk. So if you're comparing to ammo today, like the technology of the ammo, like it's getting less and less important to say like have a 12 gauge 3.5 inch cell, right? Like you aren't needing that sort of, because the ammo's gotten so much better that you really don't need that to shoot it, to shoot ducks at a certain distance and whatnot. So is it similar, like at the end, like they had this bigger gun because they could, say, shoot farther with it? Like, was that the way around, like having a black powder gun, make it like just heavier firepower? Is that what they're looking for in that?
Well, if you've ever fired a black powder, you get into a smaller bore type of shotgun, very weak. They're not casting. They're not casting enough lead, and there's a delay in the firing. A lot of smoke is created.
Right.
But they were just giving themselves the advantage by having a larger bore and more powder.
Right.
Something to reach out. Rick can address that more with recent time about I haven't hunted in years.
I guess what my question really is though is like how deadly could those market guns really be in comparison to what we have now? Because you're thinking this black powder, they're gonna have to reload that thing. It's gonna take time versus a repeating shotgun.
So if you're talking percussion guns, right? Yeah, you're going to have to reload, but they could reload those pretty quickly. And I think kind of what you're getting at is the punt gun had a function of actually trying to kill a whole lot of birds at one time.
Mass destruction.
Yeah, correct. And because you like we mentioned before, you probably only have one shot at a flock on them, right?
Right.
And the other thing too, you got to think of, not only were they big boars, but a lot of times they were really, really long, especially when like I said, when you talk about later, when you get into the actual breech loaders, right? They're really long shells too. So you've got a bunch of lead going down there. So now when you start talking about the other,
these 4 guns, and 8 gauge guns. Yeah.
Yeah, correct. 4, 8 gauge. So when you start talking about those, you're still throwing a lot of lead down range, but nothing like that. And what you're kind of getting at is, I think your idea with a 4 and 8 bore market gun, you're still probably shooting single ducks or, maybe a small group of ducks, or, I'm sure there's no doubt they would sneak up on ducks too and shoot them off the water and get more than one. But
right. And they would bait them in and shoot them in groups. Yeah.
But it was certainly a different concept. But yeah, it's like you're talking about comparing them to modern shells today. Yeah. Well, number one, they were shooting lead. So we know that lead performs better than your modern steel. But it's a matter of you didn't have the powder. It wasn't as good. So it was, like Richard said, it's giving you the advantage of throwing out a lot of lead, to either hit as many ducks as you can with one shot, or, just not miss ducks, as well. So.
Yeah, and they tend to be less of the crude guns. They tend to be a nicer gun. Who are making these market guns for the most part during this time? What makers are we seeing for market guns?
A lot of them.
Yeah.
I don't know which ones you have down there, Richard. Which ones do you have at the museum?
He is only American, which you could say.
Yeah, there's even a market gun down there made by Hiram Berdan, that had a company, and he was a Berdan sharpshooter during the Civil War. He had a regiment of sharpshooters, but he had a gunsmithing, prior to the Civil War, and obviously it was made custom order, for a person that was, market shooting. When I use the term market, the people weren't going out for sport. They wanted to get a lot of ducks. They were, let's just say it isn't market. It wasn't the selling and market. They were feeding a large family. I guess maybe giving them whatever advantage with a larger weapon. A normal person that was just going to go hunt and get a 1 or 2 waterfowl, to feed himself and maybe his wife and maybe a kid, he would have used a 12 gauge of some sort, or some sort of a smaller. He wouldn't have gone to the effort of these. Rick mentioned about the long barrel, larger bore, 6 gauge, 8 gauge type of things, and even as well as 4 gauge. They were more of a for a purpose, shooting a large number, or making every one of your shots count. Maybe you have to fire 10 rounds, you get 10 ducks.
Right.
Most people would be happy with getting 1.
Yeah, and that makes sense because these aren't wealthy people, so they're wanting to make sure, every shot counts and that they're getting, they don't want to be wasting money out there.
There were So the other thing I would add too, though, there were like, you just talk about like making the shot, right? I mean, there were actually like wealthy people as well that weren't necessarily about the market hunting, but they would buy them not only for like as their own personal duck guns, but also too, like you see like pigeon shoots at the time. Some of those guys would be shooting really large bore stuff just because you're, you have better efficiency of killing stuff with those. So you did see that kind of stuff, but you can kind of tell the difference based on what it is. The market hunter guns are going to be probably more crude, or some of the punt guns might not be, just because that was a business to them. But that was just kind of the way it was is at that time, because of they're not like modern loads, as people are going to try and get more lead down range just to be more efficient. So,
okay, so we kind of mentioned on a little bit that the guns that you have, Richard, are American, and what you'll find in most punt guns and waterfowling guns, to early waterfowling guns, they tend to be mostly European makers. So when does American manufacturers start, making more, like kind of picking up the pace for waterfowling weapons?
Well, I mean, it shifts with the personalized weapon, smokeless powder and breech loading.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, how many people have seen a Winchester 1897 that their great grandfather had? That's when the shift. Not to mention Europeans were still supplying us a great number of weapons, but it really came with the cartridge, breech loading cartridge advent. But what we're focused in here, we keep going back to the term market hunting and multiple shots, and pretty much it ended. It ended in 1918 in America, even though there's poachers that continue, much like, reminds me of in liquor, with the July of 1919, they outlawed liquor in the United States, and we had prohibition for 14 years. It didn't stop people from drinking. It didn't stop people from putting a still and going, and creating alcohol. A lot of my family did it. They were from Virginia and North Carolina. I mean, I'll be the first to admit it. But it didn't stop market hunting.
No. And didn't market hunting kind of have a small resurgence during the Depression? Like, didn't they kind of bring those back?
Yeah, because what I mentioned, like in my family, my father, he grew up during the Depression, and they had, before he went into World War II, they had to hunt to eat. So he really didn't see it as a sport. Later it was my grandfather continued. He did the same thing, but he still liked it. So I had to go hunt with my grandfather. So, yeah, the Depression, absolutely. And then nobody stopped. Well, they wanted the food.
Yeah, they had other problems to deal with.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, this is a good spot for our break, so we'll come back in a minute. We've talked a lot about punt guns and market guns, and I kind of want to talk a little bit about, before I let y'all go, about classic hunting guns, and kind of a little bit about the market of them, and just some random questions. But to start, as collecting with these, classic hunting guns, side by sides, and we can get into repeating and things like that, seems to be the most popular currently that you're selling in hunting arms, particularly waterfowling.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously you get collectors of all kinds of different stuff. It's hard to say what the most popular is, but it's the ones everybody's heard of. Obviously, Parker shotguns and L.C. Smith shotguns, and then Winchester Model 21s, and we start talking about American-made doubles. Obviously, there's, as Richard already mentioned, the Winchester 1897s, the Model 12s, Browning A5s, Browning Superpose. Those are just kind of the classic ones that everybody grew up around or grew up wanting, and so now they're collecting. Those are probably the most popular ones I think that we see.
So I have a question, within that. So has there been any trends like throughout the years with those guns? Like, has there been areas where the doubles were really popular and then maybe some of those like early things like the A5 or those early pumps? Like, has there been trends throughout selling antique guns throughout the years? Like, and do you know what they are?
Yeah, I mean, it all kind of goes. Everything goes in cycles, and we see it not only just in shotguns, but every type of collectible firearm. Where, at some point there's a whole generation of people that were really into, maybe say the American doubles, and or like you mentioned, they grew up in they saw their grandpa shooting a Model 12, so then they wanted that and they started collecting that, right? And so it kind of goes in cycles. But the one thing that we always and like I said, this is whether it's shotguns or revolvers or military guns, it's like the best of the best stuff out there is always it always has new buyers out there. So that's always what we see, kind of always trending upwards, I guess.
Yeah. Has there been any, I don't know. So we talked about like the technology of like the ammo lately, like especially now with the new like steel and stuff, like how it's so much cleaner now. Are people buying? Have you noticed that people buying more like older side by sides because now they can shoot it with this newer ammo where they couldn't before? Is that like, have they been buying? I mean, I know not some of these big guns, no one's shooting them. Some of these more expensive ones, but have you seen any like change in that they're actually able to shoot some of these guns, and are people buying them to shoot them so they can kind of have that feel of what it's like to hunt with them?
Yeah, I think that's always been a kind of a shotgun thing. I think always shotgun collectors always kind of have the idea that they're going to go out and shoot the guns they buy. I mean, that's not obviously universal, but I think there's a lot of people that do that. Obviously, they've always been able to shoot lead out of them. So I think they've always been out and shot them. As far as with your more modern loads being able to duck hunt with them. I think there's certainly people out there that do that. I don't think it's necessarily the majority, just because I guess if I were to take a classic gun like that out duck hunting, the last thing I'd worry about would be the shells I'm shooting. It'd be the mud and the water and the
I agree. I 100% agree. I don't like it at all, but I just noticed that, but I'm a curator and a historian, so I have a different perspective, but your average duck hunter does not.
There's definitely people out there that do it. I don't think it's the driving force to that market. Yeah, I mean, I certainly, like I said, I think shotgun guys are a little different in the fact that they will go out and shoot them.
One of the things I've always found by being in the waterfowling, like history field, that people like Richard are hard to come by when it comes to collecting shotguns. I find them, like, in the scheme of collecting guns, shotgun collectors are not necessarily, there's not as many of them, or at least you don't know about them as much. So what is the percentage, or you think, like, in antique guns, what is the percentage of people collecting shotguns within the whole antique gun market?
I don't know. What would you say, Richard?
I bet it's 10%.
Yeah.
If that, very, very low percentage. My estimation, Rick would have more of a feel there, but what I've seen is very few people are collecting antique shotguns per se. Most of them are enthusiasts that buy high-end sporting weapons. They're buying the over-under Winchester 101s or I don't even know. Rick would know more of that. Italian shotgun Rosinis. It's a gray area to me.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? Why do you think less people collect? Yeah, like waterfowling shotgun, or upland game. It can be any sporting shotguns.
Yeah, it's the things that drive like Colt and Winchester collectors, right? Are a lot of like the movies and just the history of America. And I think it's a smaller. It's just a smaller market with the guys that are into classic shotguns. And like Richard talked about, we definitely have guys that are into more modern, new shotguns that are like, they're like the highest form of gun making today. Yeah. So there's those buyers. There's definitely the people that are into American doubles. And again, those guys are are kind of their nostalgia is with that hunting background, but I don't think most hunters necessarily are gun collectors. So it's just a different thing. Whereas again, what's driving the Colts and Winchesters and the other stuff is the classic Western movies that everybody grew up
cowboy
watching.
Movies.
Yeah. There's just more people. There's more people that watch Roy Rogers than their grandpa had a Parker shotgun, I guess. So
yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I've always wondered that, but yeah, that makes sense. When you're talking about the really high end ones, I remember I never even really knew that existed because I'm just a duck hunter and then museum person. But when I first started at my first week at Bass Pro, they have the Beretta gallery there, and they had some Beretta gun that was worth they were selling. It was brand new, and they were selling it for I don't think it was like $150,000 or something, and it was bought within an hour of opening or something crazy. The guy I think flew from China or somewhere to buy it. I didn't know that was a thing until then.
Yeah, they get more expensive than that too,
yeah,
so.
I assume so. Yeah, they're selling this one in a Bass Pro Shop, so I'm guessing they're not going to put the most expensive one out there. But yeah, I just didn't even know that was a thing. They're I guess art is what we would call them at that point.
Yeah, it is. That's kind of one of our big taglines that we talk about is not all art is framed. We have that in a lot of our marketing, and it's so true with those guns. It's true with a lot of the early antique American Colts and Winchesters, but yeah, at some point it goes from being just a functional piece of equipment to certainly art.
So I have a question, actually, that was from my coworker, John, who's also a co-host of this podcast. But he had a question about, this is and Rick, you might be the one to answer this. So these early guns, these side-by-sides, even saying the early pumps and the early semis, like the A5, the quality of these guns, they were made with, such good quality. And do you think... So a lot of these guns, some of them have been brought back, but a lot of these guns, were discontinued at one point or are discontinued. Do you think that, I don't know how to say this nicely, but in a marketing sense, that they got rid of these, because they were such good quality? You think people just didn't, they bought their gun and they had their gun and they didn't need another gun? So manufacturers started producing, different guns that, they didn't want these, I don't know how to say this, but basically new modern guns that I shoot, they don't necessarily last like these older guns do. Some of these side-by-sides, they're still in perfect working condition. A lot of them are. So do you think that led to their being discontinued later?
Well, so, yeah, I think it probably depends on what type of gun you're talking about. When you're talking about side-by-sides, yeah, the cost, not only we talk about the cost of making a side-by-side in America today it'd be pretty astronomical, but we really don't even have the expertise to do it for the most part. There's a couple guys out there that are doing it, but they're, the cost of making one of those, and that's relative to a autoloader or a pump shotgun. They're so much more expensive to manufacture because of that, the process of having to have two barrels basically shoot to the same spot.
Is that why, just as pause, is that why over-unders are seen more than side-by-sides? Is it easier to do?
No, that's just a preference. You have the single sighting plane as opposed to, you got two barrels sticking out there.
Okay.
So that really is just a preference thing. Over-unders are expensive as well to manufacture when you compare them to, pump shotguns and autoloaders. So that's how those died out. You talk about Parker shotguns and everything. It's just they got to be so expensive, especially when the Great Depression hit, that they couldn't afford to do them anymore, right? But then you talk about autoloaders and pump guns. It wasn't necessarily that those were inherently too expensive to make. It's just hand making guns, right? I know Winchester in 1964. I'm sure you've heard of pre-64 Winchesters. Well, Winchester made a company decision at that point to basically just cheapen how they made everything, and so that's. And it was a lot more machine manufactured than it was hand fitted type stuff. So that's where you saw that. The same with every every industry in the world, really. At some point we got to make this stuff cheaper and not as high quality. So
right, and more efficient. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, because you just don't see any people hunting with side-by-sides duck hunting anymore. If you do see anything, you see an over-under. And, there are people that are religious about it, But, yeah, you just don't see many side-by-sides anymore.
Yeah, that's a preference thing. Just guys like just looking down one rib. Well, I mean, even with the side by side, you're looking down one rib, but looking down the rib and seeing one barrel, I should say.
Yeah, interesting. So, Richard, do you have any finding stories or any gun that you were after for a long time? Any any kind of like stories like that you'd like to share?
Well, we're going to have like 2 or 3 more shows. I can. I can.
Just give me one. I know it's hard to pick.
Oh, it's very difficult. I guess one that comes to mind is when I found out one of my family members, my great uncle was in the 66 Western Illinois Sharpshooters during the Civil War. He got in like in 1864, and I mean they went on Sherman's March to the Sea and whatever. But the biggest thing that they are credited with is they were originally armed with St. Louis half-stock percussion rifles, and they had to actually fire. They had to shoot 2 to 3 inch groups at 100 yards. Imagine that back in the day. So they were outfitted by a firm named Dimmick in St. Louis, and he ended up getting a contract for 1,000 rifles, and he could not fulfill the contract. He was overwhelmed, and many of these rifles he farmed out. He had other but they varied in caliber. So to make a long story short, I've always had sought those out. But once they wore out these Dimmick rifles, they ended up using. People have heard of the Henley lever action rifle. And when they went on Sherman's March to the Sea, there was that damn Yankee. The Confederates would call it that damn Yankee rifle that fired 14 shots. Loaded on Monday and shot till Friday. And I actually was able to get one of those rifles. I have a family that the gentleman actually went to reunions with my great uncle after the Civil War. There was the GAR with the Grand Army of the Republic. So that made my day, I guess.
Yeah, that's cool. Rick, do you got any good stories, gun stories?
Yeah, I got a few good ones. One I can think of. It's I'm trying to think if there's any shotgun ones. I can't.
That's all right.
Can't think of anything off the top of my head. But one I think of and it's actually not even a gun. It's kind of interesting. But as you can imagine, we get a lot of people call us about particular guns or other items. Sometimes people will just random off the wall stuff that they'll send us, right, that they think we want to auction. And one time one of the guys that worked for me thought he had one of these and was like, hey, can I tell this lady that we don't want her jewelry box, right? And I was like, well, okay, whatever, let me look at it, and so I look at it. And I just say, we want this lady's jewelry box. And he's like, what are you talking about? I said, this isn't really a jewelry box. She uses it for jewelry, but on the top of the box, it said, from Samuel Colt to Elijah K. Root. And Elijah K. Root was Samuel Colt's son-in-law. And basically, he at one point gave him this whole presentation of firearms, and they all had these glass cases on top. Well, this is one of the cases for one of these guns that got separated from the gun. So sure enough, I look at her paper, and her last name was Root, and she talks about, we called her up, and basically she was from the Root family, and it got passed down through her family, but she didn't have any guns, so she used it for a jewelry box. So we got that in, and I don't remember what we ended up selling that for, $25,000, $30,000, something like that. Richard, you might remember that. And supposedly somebody out there knew the specific gun that was supposed to go with that. So I don't know if they ever ended up getting reunited or not. But
that would be really cool if they got reunited. I'm interested to know if that did. Yeah, that's really cool. All right. So, Richard, I had on the show, his episode hasn't come out yet. So, but it will by the time yours comes out. John Munson, decoy collector. And he told me about your Jack Musgrove collection. And I didn't know much about Jack Musgrove. So can you tell me about your collection? So when did you get into him and how many of his birds do you have? And he's an interesting story. So we talked a lot about him. And so the audience, if they listen to John's, they'll get like a good history of like who Jack was and like what kind of decoys they were. But I just kind of I didn't know you had a lot of his decoys, and I wanted to kind of hear your story of it.
Well, Musgrove was the reason I knew of Musgrove is he was involved in the state of Iowa, as I recall, something with the conservation, what have you, and he ended up writing a book, or he was in conjunction with another individual about waterfowl shooting on the Mississippi River and also, in Iowa. And you look in the book and it showed these decoys that were made by Musgrove. Well, where do you find those? Well, I went to the Messiah, who everybody knows, most famous guy, Joe Tonelli. And I said, can you give me, you have any of these Musgroves? He said, Richie, he says, and we both know Joe and love him. And he said, I got some of those 25 years ago. I don't know where the hell they went. I think the family still have them. Well, lo and behold, next thing we know, Munson ends up doing an article. He has a large group of them for sale. He found a guy that knew Munson well, or knew Musgrove well, and had all the decoys. So I bought a great number of them from there, and I think I'm not even sure, I have a lot of decoys, 25, 30 of them. And they go everywhere from field blue gooses to mallards and other species. But the interesting thing about Musgrove is if he made a decoy of it, he shot that type of bird.
Yeah, so I saw that, and I was looking at that article, and there's a Eurasian in there,
right,
and an old squaw.
One of the neatest ones that I got is it was a hybrid. It was a hybrid between a mallard and a pintail drake.
Ah, yeah. Well, I can see that happening, but where's this Eurasian and old squaw in Iowa?
If he got it, he shot it. And that's what intrigued. And he was a very skilled craftsman.
He learned. Didn't he learn from somebody that was famous? I think of somebody else. There
was another carver there, and he was from the Des Moines, Iowa area. But now we're talking back in the 1940s, and but Musgrove's work is second to none. For very good and very lifelike, and he was very detailed in what he did. But so yes, Mr. Munson was absolutely correct. I purchased from both him and the guy that knew him well was a guy named Barry Kenny, and just a gentleman, and he went on to carve his own decoys, but Musgrove was the one, and it's in a time period. My collection Musgrove falls in it very well. I don't do anything like recent, but I think they go as late as the 1960s, and they go all the way back to the 1940s, and it's a time period I like.
I don't know. That's like a debatable time period for decoys. Like you could maybe call it contemporary, but I don't know. It's borderline. I don't know if you can really. People probably have a lot of opinions about it, but it's borderline. I've never really understood what the definition, like everyone's definition of contemporary is.
Well, in speaking with Joe, pretty much agreed upon is probably the 1970s and before. But pretty much they're before the 1970s.
Yeah, that's what I would think.
One of my favorite carver was a guy named Heck Whittington. I knew his family and such, and he lived up till 1981. And he carved till the day he died. And but most of he yielded with the times the items he carved in the 1970s were more decorative, but they were very nicely done. But people want the stuff that you can throw in the water and float, and that's or use in a field like the field geese.
Yeah,
and that's not only do they want 50 years old, pre-1970, they want floaters for the most part. What we call them hollow bodied with a weight.
Yeah. So Musgrove, did he hunt over his decoys, or did he just make one after he?
No, he hunted over them. I mean, he was an avid sportsman, and that's what if he made it, he pretty much, for the most part, those hunted. Whether he hunted the geese and he put them in the field, which those.
How many did he make? Do you know?
It was not a lot. I mean, between Barry and Mr. Munson, they would know. But if he made 200 birds, I'd be surprised, which is very low. Maybe it's 100, 150 birds. It's whatever Jack was talking about, that's the number of birds, which is not many.
Well, all right. Well, is there anything before we go that either of you would like to add or tell our audience?
No, I don't think so. Other than I appreciate what Ducks Unlimited does. I'm on a local committee. I have been for I don't know how many years now, but I certainly appreciate everything you guys do.
Well, thank you. You got anything, Richard?
From my standpoint, what I appreciate is the professionalism that your museum dealt me, and the fact that I've had other instances with museums and if I've loaned my collections, and I will say that I'm very privileged and humbled that you guys took the effort to put my babies out there, so to speak, and present them well, and I can't say enough good, and I said I'm 500 miles away and very busy, but I'm coming down to view the collection, and you and I were discussing about how time flies. It's already been there 9 months, and it seemed like I gave it to you a month ago.
It does. Well, thank you so much for that. That means a lot. I really appreciate that.
I will add, if you guys have any sort of influence, would you guys tell them to stop making the Busch Light Ducks Unlimited neon signs? Because my wife buys every damn one of them. And
I can't do anything about that. I'm sorry. You might have some more in your future.
We're in Iowa, Busch Light is like water.
Yeah, you're probably going to have more in your future. I can't really do much to help you there.
All right.
I'll take it. I'll let other people know, though I think it will fall on deaf ears.
All right.
Well, Rick and Richard, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks again for coming on the show. Thanks to our producer, Chris Isaac, and thanks to our listeners for supporting wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the ducks. Stay tuned to the ducks.